Is there any way out of that? Maybe the jealousy study, or is this a vicious downward spiral? Whenever there's any kinds of signs like this, that means you're screwed. Get out. Or is this just the puzzle of the human condition and humans getting together and having to solve that puzzle?
I have non-traditional views on jealousy. I'm not a jealousy researcher, but I have done some research on sexuality. And I personally think that jealousy is basically always a red flag, because what it means is that the person who is jealous isn't secure in the relationship. And the reason that they're not secure in the relationship is either because the relationship is wrong for them or because they are insecure in themselves. And I don't think it is a sign of love. I don't think it is a sign of, you want to protect your mate. I think it is mostly control. And it's the desire to control and to possess. And jealousy, we know, is a precursor to intimate partner violence almost always. As in, not all jealousy leads to violence, of course, but all violence is the jealousy is a precursor. And quite a lot of that is imagined things that the partner is doing, not even based on reality. Then we go back to our deception detection research, where we're bad at telling whether someone's lying or not. And so if you're basing how you're interacting with that person on a faulty lie detector, you're going to make bad decisions. So the research also bears out that most people are really bad at monogamy. So most people either have cheated on a significant other, maybe not their current significant other, but a significant other, or have cheated multiple times. And that's just consistently found in the research.
So maybe there's justification to be jealous.
I think it's the other way around. I think monogamy is setting us up to fail. So I think monogamy is a social construct. That's a nice idea for some people. And I think that, at least based on the research on how people actually behave, they're not actually behaving in a monogamous way. If you're cheating on your partner, that is not monogamy. That is polyamory, potentially. So the love of multiple people. And it's lying, and it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm polyamorous, and I believe that you can love multiple people. I don't know that everyone is always going to meet lots of people at the same time that they're going to love. But I think that there's been a move towards more people embracing open relationships and non-traditional relationship structures. And I think that is healthy to at least have as an option. So I think the idea that there's this one-size-fits-all for relationships is really harmful to a lot of people. And it just doesn't really work for everybody.
Well, if we could just focus in on one component, it seems to me one of the problems is honesty as a hard requirement and good communication as another hard requirement. Because that feels like the prerequisites for avoiding all these problems.
And I guess with jealousy, what I'm thinking of is actually not an instance of jealousy. So where you have a feeling of, I feel left out, or I feel, it's more that sort of persistent feeling of, I am a jealous person. And that's where I would say that is usually a red flag. And you're right, it's a red flag partly because it means the person's probably bad at communicating, or you are as a couple. Like, it's not necessarily just the jealous person's fault. Yeah. It's just that there's something happening in this dynamic that is bad psychologically, and that should be addressed, or maybe it's not the right relationship.
So the fact that a lot of people cheat, does that mean every single person that cheated, does that mean they're probably not going to be good at monogamy? I guess if you can just analyze all of human civilization as it stands and give advice that's definitively true for everyone.
That's exactly what psychologists do all the time. Yeah. We make sweeping statements.
This is great. No, I think it's really interesting because I see all those things as romantic, choosing not to cheat, you choosing to dedicate yourself fully to another person. I mean, it's all this romantic, and then some people do cheat and your heart is broken and you write a song about it, and then you move on and you try to repair yourself and be vulnerable to another human being and all that.
But why deny yourself the beautiful spectrum of human experience? I mean, it's like eating one meal for the rest of your life. Like, why? You don't have to do that. You can have lots of beautiful people around. And
so for me, actually focusing on a single thing, you get to explore. You mentioned puzzle. Over time, you get to see the nuance, like the beauty of the puzzle. You realize that it's an infinitely long project to really understand another human being. And so, like, if you focus, you don't get distracted. So that applies. I'm a person, when I find a meal I really like, I'll stick to it for a long time. I'm definitely a monogamy person, I think. But that also could be a component of like where I grew up. There's a certain cultural upbringing, and maybe my brain is not allowing myself certain possibilities, you know?
I think it's more that I want people to feel like they have a choice. And that's the important thing. And I think all we see is monogamy everywhere, all the time. And it's this one version of how we can live our lives. And I think it's not the only. And I think that having conversations with your partner as well, especially early, it's harder to bring this up later on. But to have it early and say, how do you actually want to structure your life? And I think, how do you want to structure your relationship as part of that? And especially if you're going to commit yourself to one person, one primary person, or one exclusive person, that's part of it. And I think then you also, you know, don't have to lie to each other if you do cheat, or you can talk about it in a different way if you feel like there's, certain capacity to be honest about whom you're attracted to and how that might impact your life more generally.
So how difficult is polyamory? I think a lot of people would be curious about that kind of stuff. Does jealousy come up? Is it difficult to navigate?
Can be. I mean, all relationships can be difficult to navigate.
That's true.
I think it's the same. And the same risk factors. If you're going in because you're trying to fix something about yourself, you're going to have a hard time.
Hmm.
Much like if you're dating a single person, if you're trying to fix something and this is going to be the solution to the thing you feel is broken about yourself, it's going to be hard. But if you're going in coming from a good place and you're going, I want to be open and I want to connect with people and I want to love people or person, then you're going to have a better time.
What's like the perfect polyamorous relationship look like? Can you really love multiple people deeply?
I think so. You can love people in different ways, and also you can love lots of people deeply, I think. And I think, again, it's so research on bisexuality, so I'm bi, has also found that people who are bi are more likely to be in non-traditional relationships. And one of the reasons for that is probably also because we constantly get asked to justify our sexuality as well. And so if constantly you're being asked if one person's enough for you, if one gender is enough for you, if you're in a relationship with one person, for example, if I'm in a relationship with a man, do you miss women? And it's like, I don't ask you that if you're in a relationship with a woman, do you miss women? Like, you probably do, but that's just other women than your partner. It has nothing to do with being bi. And so I think there's this constant barrage of questions of what does it mean? Is it real? How do you choose? What does a relationship look like? Do you constantly want threesomes? There's this constant hypersexualization also, especially of women that we find in the research that can also lead to really negative outcomes for mental health and for things like risk of sexual violence. But on the other hand, you've got bisexual people themselves saying, yeah, but I feel like I also have the superpower that I can love more widely and gender doesn't really matter in terms of whom I'm capable of loving. And so relationship structures almost come with that conversation. It's not that we need to be non-monogamous or that we need to be in these kinds of relationships. It's more that I think if you've engaged so deeply with your sexuality, partly because society's forced you to, then you're also going to be thinking about relationship structures more generally and going, actually, I'm going to choose this one.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, your like sexual preferences and relationship structure preferences, some of the choice has to do with how society is going to respond to it. So if you have to explain it every time you go to a party, you might maybe not want to do that or talk about it or at least be open about it. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of annoying conversations you have to do if you're polyamorous, like some of the which you've mentioned. And yes, there's effects of like over sexualizing the people involved. Yeah.
Or thinking they're lying. So with men, I wrote a book called Bi, The Hidden Culture, History, and Science of Bisexuality. And I did that after I created a bisexual research group. So I wasn't a sexuality researcher, but as a bi person and a scientist, I was interested in the science of bisexuality. And I couldn't really find it. It was really hard to figure out what people were actually learning about bisexual people in comparison to other kinds of queer people. And one of the things I've found is that the terms that are used are not necessarily bi. And so it could be things like plurisexual. So if you type into Google Scholar the word bisexual, you're going to get a lot of confusing things. Also because bisexual is used for like two sexes where you have multiple sex or you can change. And so they're bisexual.
Right.
Yeah, which is different entirely. And so I think partly out of that, researchers started using words like plurisexual and omnisexual is another one. And so if you're looking for research on this, plurisexual is probably the word.
What does
But
omnisexual mean?
it's just the same. It's just
Okay, got it.
another word where it's all. Sometimes pansexual is also used. And again, the idea being that it's all genders.
So how should we think about bisexuality? Is it fluid? Like day to day, month to month, year to year, fluid, who you're attracted to? Or is it at the same time have the capacity to be attracted to anyone or attracted to everyone? What's the right way to think about it?
I think the right way to think about it is that I'm not attracted to most people, but I can be attracted to people regardless of gender. Much like you're probably not attracted to most people, but you are attracted to people of a certain gender, maybe. And so it's the same as being heterosexual in terms of potentially my pool of people who might be interested in. It's just that their gender is irrelevant.
What's the biggest thing that people misunderstand about bisexuality?
The biggest thing that researchers find people misunderstand about bisexuality is that it's a phase, and that it's this idea that it's transient, that it's always changing, and that it's a stepping stone. So I think a lot of people still see bisexuality as on the way to gay town. Sort of like you're on your way, but you haven't quite committed, and you're still stuck in expectations of society. You haven't quite let go yet, but really you're gay. And that's especially true for men. And so when you look at research on bisexual men, which is actually how the research started. So I think now when we think of bisexuality, we think of women. And it's true that today, twice as many women identify as bisexual as men. But if you look at the history of this and the research on bisexuality over time, it was the other way around. So someone called Alfred Kinsey was one of the first sexuality researchers in recent history, certainly. And he, after World War II, did this really big study of sexual behavior in the human male, it was called. He was a biologist himself, and so he thought in taxonomies, and he was doing research on gall wasps, so insects. And this idea of human sexuality was sort of thrown at him after the war because there's also this whole move to get people to, well, reproduce and to rebuild America. And so sexuality was partly, and sex specifically, was becoming more of an area of interest, both in terms of research and in terms of policy and funding. And so Alfred Kinsey was asked, do you want to do a class on human sexual behavior? And he was like, I know nothing about this. And so he spent about a year just listening to students' questions about like what they want to know about sex. And he realized that he was looking for research to try and build up this course that he was probably going to teach. And he realized that he couldn't answer most of their questions because the research hadn't been done. And so a lot of the questions were around what is normal? You know, if I feel this during sex, is that normal? How often do people have sex? Should I want these? What about these fantasies? What does it mean? What if I have homosexual fantasies? What if I engage in this kind of... And so he was looking at all of these questions and collating them. And then he went out and did these huge studies. And he interviewed thousands of people himself, but also had all these research assistants who were out there interviewing people in America about their sexual behavior, which, I mean, just picture the time. It's like the 1940s. This is quite a conservative time. I mean, certainly more than we might expect now. And here's this researcher asking incredibly personal questions about thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And he ended up finding, and this is one of the big findings in this book that he published called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, which was a bestseller for an entire year. He sold out auditoriums. They had to sometimes add the room next to the room he was in because there was so much desire to go to his lectures about sex that they had to like connect radios to other halls to give people enough space to sit down. He was basically a rock star. And again, I think this challenges a misconception we have about sexuality, that we think of it as this sort of woke thing now, that the rainbow flag and all this stuff is sort of this modern invention almost. But this is the 40s. This was happening. People were going to these talks. People were having these conversations. And he created something called the Kinsey scale. And so the Kinsey scale is from 0 to 6. And he found that it was not useful to apply a binary to people's sexual desires and sexual orientation. It was more useful to put them on a continuum because most people were not exclusively homosexual or exclusively heterosexual. Most people were somewhere in between. And so 0 was exclusively heterosexual tendencies, and 6 was exclusively homosexual. And he would place people based on all the things they told him somewhere on the scale. And about half of men were somewhere in the middle, not exclusively either, and about a quarter of women. Now, think about the time.
It was a very conservative time.
Well, and it's post-war, though. So I think that mattered as well. So there's something called a homosocial environment, which has nothing to do with being gay. That has to do with being in a situation where you are with people of the same gender as you. So a homosocial environment are things like prisons, where you only have men or only have women, um, war, which at that point they just had. And so you have a lot of men who are exclusively in the company of men and maybe looking around going, well, now that my options are different, maybe I'm going to choose from this pool. Anyway, so he found that it was that way around, that a lot of people have these fantasies or actions that they've engaged in. And then there were other researchers, other male researchers, who found similar things. And then at some point in the 70s, it swapped, and it felt like maybe more men were identifying as gay, and there were maybe less people who would have called themselves bi, and suddenly this became a thing more for women. So I think that there's some social things going on, there's some research things going on, but actually bi men have been studied for a long time as well.
Okay, so you said a lot of interesting things. So there is a difference between the truth and the socially acknowledged thing. So there's social elements. I don't know. This might be anecdotal, but I know a few women, friends of mine who identify as bisexual. I don't know a single guy friend who identifies as bisexual. They're either gay or straight. So there's still a social thing going on,
Definitely.
right?
Definitely. And I think that research consistently shows that bisexual men are more likely to identify as gay or
As gay.
straight. And gay, what depends. So if they have what you might refer to as a homosexual lifestyle, so they engage in sort of going to queer parties, maybe go on Grindr or other gay apps, that would be much more a lifestyle thing where you've embraced and you see this as part of your identity, that you are part of this queer community. It's much easier to say you're gay than you are bi most often. Also because there's queer phobia within the queer community. And so you might get gay men saying to a bi man, come on, I was bi once. That's a classic. I was bi once. Or, come on, you're actually gay. It's the same that you get the other way around with bi women, is that because it's seen as performative, the idea being that bisexual women are doing it for attention, but the attention of men specifically, that, well, they're all going to go back to men anyway, and they're just doing it. It's a phase. It's this thing that they're doing actually to be sexy to men, not because they're actually interested in women. And so there's this lesbian bi thing going on, which is often quite hostile. Not always, but often. And there's this gay male bi thing that going on, which is different in nature, but is also potentially hostile. So in both, saying you're bi can be problematic, but for men more so.
Do you like the Kinsey scale as a sort of very simple reduction to that there's a spectrum? I also saw the Klein sexual orientation grid that has a few parameters, like who you're attracted to, how you're actually behaving, the fantasies you have, social preference, lifestyle preferences, all that kind of stuff, self-identification, what you actually say publicly, all those different dimensions. Or is the Kinsey scale like pretty damn good approximation?
The Kinsey scale is a good start. And the Klein grid, I think, is much more fun in some
Mm-hmm.
ways. So the Klein grid came out of research by Alfred Kinsey and others like Havelock Ellis, but we won't get into him. And Fritz Klein was a male researcher doing research also on bisexuality. He was specifically a therapist, and he was looking at people who were struggling with their sexuality. And so people would show up in the 70s and 80s in his practice, and they would say, I'm struggling with my sexuality. And he would say, how can I help you? And they would say things like, I wish I wasn't interested in men, and I'm a man. And he would then work through sort of what that means. Does that mean you don't want to have these feelings? Does that mean that you don't want to have these attractions? Does that mean that it's the implications of like how your friends and family will see you? That's the problem. And so he created this much more complex scale, which I think is really interesting for everybody to do, no matter what their sexuality is. Because what it is it gets you to think about things like, yeah, your sexual identity, easy. But not just that, but in past, present, and ideal. And so if you say, well, I used to identify as straight, now I identify as bisexual, and then I have in my head, this doesn't mean that other people think this, in my head, I have an ideal, which could be straight, because that's what maybe society's told us we should be, but it could also be something else. And so I've also had friends who've gone, past, present, straight, but ideal bi. So you get into these interesting dynamics where Sometimes people just wish they were a different sexuality than they were for other reasons. And then there's other things in the scale that ask about your lifestyle. So, for example, if you are going to parties, queer parties, if you have queer friends, then you might have a homosexual lifestyle, even if you're straight. But then again, it's how much lifestyle would you like? And so for me, that was a real moment where I was looking at that going, wow, my lifestyle is really straight.
Mhm.
And maybe I need to change this. And so he was using these attractions and fantasies and identities and the past, present, ideal to help people to think through all these complicated feelings we have around our sexuality and to identify problem like sticking points.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So maybe the presumption there is if everything is aligned, the fantasies, the ideal partner, all of those things, that's probably the healthiest place to be.
Right. And so he would look at especially the ideal and the present. And if those were different, so if you said, I wish I was bi, but I'm straight, or I am bi, but I wish I was straight, or I'm homosexual and I wish I was straight, he would say, let's talk about that. And he'd try to work through it. And the term he used for bisexual people who were uncomfortable in their own sexuality was being a troubled bisexual. And so I think any sexuality can be troubled. I think you could be a troubled straight person, a troubled homosexual person, a troubled asexual person. And just thinking about why and which aspects are maybe missing, I think is really healthy for people to do.
Meaning there's some puzzles that you haven't quite figured out. Maybe you haven't been honest with yourself about your preferences, all that kind of stuff.
I don't really like talking about honesty with yourself. I think that's a high bar. And I think it's also often weaponized against people, especially by men, whereas this idea of you're not really being honest, you're actually gay. And so I think this idea of we're not being honest with our own sexuality, that's a big word. I think it's more that maybe you haven't had the right framework or the right words to think about aspects of your sexuality that are troubling to you.
How obvious, when a person is bisexual, how obvious is it to identify like the sexual orientation grid? Like, how big is the sign, whatever you are?
I think the sign is smaller than we think it is. I think that there's this tendency to assume that sexuality is something that we find and keep and consolidate from our teenage years, maybe early 20s. You maybe get university thrown in. Sort of you get your experimental years in undergrad,
Yeah.
but then you kind of have to choose. And that is a difficult requirement, I think, for a lot of people because you can't possibly know all of the things and all the people you might be interested in at that point. And we change in every other way. Why wouldn't we change in this way? So I think giving ourselves also the ability to reappraise where we're at with our own sexuality, our own desires, our own relationship status, all these things is important to keep us happy and healthy and to not run into issues that we know are faced by a lot of homosexual but also bisexual people. Like research has found that bisexual people are more likely to self-harm, they're more likely to be the victims of sexual violence, more likely to be isolated, more likely to be stalked. There's lots of different aspects of being bi that are negative, and the reason for that is mostly because bi people are least likely to be plugged into the community. So when you're going through stuff like this and you feel different and you're constantly being asked about your sexuality if you're open about it, or you're hiding it, that's also troubling, you're going to have these negative consequences, especially if you don't feel like the queer community is really a place for you. So that's where also finding your people really matters.